All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Kristen Roman. I am a staff psychologist at CBT DBT Associates, and I am also the director of the Young Adult Program. And we're here today to talk about strategies for finding focus for this fall semester that may have already started or is starting soon. And whether you are a young adult yourself or someone who knows a young adult that would like to help, hopefully this will give you some things to think about and try to do a little differently this semester. And also, obviously in the title, we have the aspect of it being in the new normal. So in the new normal, we'll also, be referencing what are some unique features here in that we might be going back and forth between remote and not, and kind of dealing with that challenge of still maybe working from home more than we'd like to, maybe feeling less comfortable going to the usual study spaces we go to and things like that. So in a moment here, I'm going to pull up the slides so we can take a look. 1 second. All right. So I want to start us off by talking about SMART goals. So SMART goals is an acronym that we use to think about defining goals in a way that is going to be most effective for us, that we're most likely to achieve our goals. So this is an acronym, and the S stands for specific. So we want to, when we set goals, we want to be as specific as possible. So rather than something like, I want to lose weight, I might say, I want to lose 12 pounds would be specific. And we also want our goals to be measurable, meaning can we tell if we've met them or not? The example of have I lost 12 pounds, that's a more obvious one that we could actually measure and track. Action-oriented is also important. So we want to focus on what is it we're going to do in order to meet our goal. So rather than just losing 12 pounds, we might also think about what's going to take to get there. So an action-oriented goal would be I'm going to work out 3 times a week, 45 minutes each time in order to lose those 12 pounds. We also want to be realistic, and realistic also relies on the deadline, right? So if I say I'm going to do that in a week, that's really unrealistic. Whereas maybe if it's like by the end of the year, that would be a little more realistic. Realistic is really the hardest one sometimes to get good at. We often set goals that are too lofty or unrealistic for our own circumstances. So the best piece of advice there is to try to take data over time and see where you might be overshooting or overestimating or underestimating yourself in terms of what's realistic, and build that in as you make further goals. The last piece of this is timely. So for something to be timely, we just want to come up with what is the deadline. And ideally, we have a mix of shorter term goals and longer term goals, maybe some goals that are for this week, others that are for this month, and maybe others that are for the whole semester. So a couple other points about goal setting for success. One is that we want to focus on process goals rather than outcome goals. So that's more of the like, what am I going to do to get there, rather than like, what's the ultimate thing I want. So instead of like, I want to pass this class, maybe the process goal is I'm going to review the material for 5 minutes at the end of each class afterwards. It gives me more of a guide of how am I going to get there. And then tasks versus time goals, that would just be, instead of I'm going to study this topic for an hour, the task goal would be I'm going to review these 2 sections in the workbook. So, a lot of times we set a time goal, but we can kind of tune out and get really distracted. And maybe we met the goal that technically we studied for that long, but it wasn't really effective. So focusing on task goals can make sure that we're actually making progress we want. When we set goals, accountability can help a lot. So telling your study partner or your roommate or a parent, what your goal is for that afternoon or the semester can definitely help, because that person might check in with us, encourage us. So keep that in mind in terms of improving your success with your goals. So we won't pause to do this, but I would encourage you to think about what is one SMART goal for the next 1 or 2 months, and then what is one SMART goal for just this next week. And you'll see this diagram shows how we ideally want our long-term goals to feed into the short-term goals and then our daily tasks. They should all be connected. Now we're going to talk a little bit about time management. So time management is a key predictor of how we do in school, our GPA, and the quality of our academic performance. So as we're talking about time management, it's helpful to think about, how do you think about time? How do you feel about time? And there's these 3 concepts: time optimism, pessimism, and realism. So time optimism would be if we think that we have more time than we actually do. Like, oh, I'll do that another time. Like, I have plenty of time. I have all day. That's kind of a time optimist. Whereas time pessimism is that we think we have less time than we actually do. That might make us really nervous. Like, I'm not going to get this done. When in reality, we actually have plenty of time. And time realism is what we're shooting for, having a more accurate assessment of how much time we have for something. And the time realism is associated with self-efficacy, self-control, and lower level of stress about academics. So if you feel like you're a little bit off, you're not necessarily a time realist, we might work to get better at our time estimation. So one thing to look at is, are you reliably inaccurate? Like, are you usually 30 minutes late to things? Or is it usually that things take about 20 minutes longer than you're guessing? Then we can kind of adjust and just start tacking on an extra 30 or 20 minutes based on that. It's also helpful to start to learn what is you time, which means how do you kind of run? How long do things take you, rather than some ideal image of what it should take someone. And a really healthy habit is to assume we're going to have distractions and interruptions. To think that, like, your roommate's never going to walk in and say something to you, or you're not going to get distracted by TikTok or Instagram. It's just unrealistic. So try to build that in and have a little bit of a buffer, knowing those distractions will happen. A really great exercise you can do to get better at time estimation is to practice estimating how long something would take versus how long it actually takes. So one thing I sometimes have the clients do is make a list of all your routine activities, getting ready for school, commuting to your farthest class, checking emails, and how long you think it'll take versus timing it. How long does it actually take? You might be surprised. There's some things that we might be really off on. And in that case, we might actually be wasting time. Like, I once worked with someone who thought it took a really long time to make a certain walk from one place to another. And they realized, oh, we could be so much more productive if we just left less time to get there. And then for other people, it's the opposite. They realize they're underestimating how long things take, and then they get really frantic and frazzled and maybe don't get to everything on their to-do list because of that underestimating. This slide is just an example of how we can really quickly lose track of time. In this case, the person's trying to work on their English paper in the morning, but they're like, first I'll just throw in a load of laundry, but then they realize they don't have any quarters for the laundry machine. They go to the neighbors to ask for some quarters, the neighbor's trying to fix something, stop to help, but then you realize, oh, they need some kind of tool they don't have. So you go with the friend to CVS, pick up what you need. But then you realize, oh, I also need to go to the bank for the quarters. But then you don't really have your debit card, and then you're running back and you realize it's late, I need lunch. And, before we know it, it's in the afternoon and we do not have the laundry done and we have not started the paper. So if this feels really relatable to you, an exercise that can help is tracking your time with a grid. This is just a super basic time grid that has every 30-minute block of the day, Sunday through Saturday. And what you could do is throughout the day, write down what you're doing to become more aware of where is time getting sucked away, where could I be more productive, and also being able to evaluate, do my priorities map onto how I'm using my time. So one thing that you could do is after this webinar, you could fill in what was your grid based on your memory for yesterday, and maybe even what's happened today so far. You could observe, like, how am I thinking and feeling about time? Like sometimes we have anxiety comes up, realizing, oh my gosh, I got so little done yesterday, or wasted so much time. And then to think about what were my priorities the past 2 days? Did that align with how I spent my time? If not, you can think about the next few days. What would an ideal time grid be where my priorities would be better mapped on to my time? Again, always leaving time for breaks and distractions to come up, not being unrealistic about it. So another good self-check-in is just asking yourself, what are your favorites or most common time wasters? You know, is it a certain app you use? Is it Reddit? Is it texting with friends? You have to keep in mind a lot of our, apps that we use are sort of designed to keep us on the app and make it so easy to waste time. So sometimes we have to limit those things or put our phone away if we're really trying to get something done. And then we can also think about our strengths. You can think about what are your golden hours, which basically means when you're most productive. For some people, that's really early in the morning. For some people, it's like late at night or midday. And look at, what am I doing during my golden hours? If I'm watching TV during my golden hours, then that's such a waste. To put in the blocks where you feel really productive, the harder stuff. And then when you tend to have a slump, like maybe later in the afternoon, try to put in some easier things or some downtime. The list of some other things that can help us save time. So, things like where we keep our stuff in the everyday stuff, having it in one spot so we're not wasting time looking for those things every morning. I really love this concept of Ohio, which stands for only handle it once. So it basically just saves time by not coming back to something again and again. So if we read an email, reply to it right then. Whereas what we often do is we read it, we might think a little bit about what we're going to say, then we shut it down and I'll come back to it. And we have to read it again, remind ourselves what it says, think about what we were going to say. So what we're doing is like wasting a lot of time and energy restarting it every time. So maybe don't even open up the email until you're ready to answer it. And then that saves us time. Similar things would be only handling, mail in one time. Like if we open up a bill, pay it right on the spot. If we're reading a textbook, if we're going to take it on a separate piece of paper, so we're not coming back to the textbook, we just look at the textbook once. So all of those are examples of Ohio as a time saver. I think more and more we're getting less paper and clutter, but if this is still an issue for you, trying to practice throwing away any paper, mail, junk that you have sitting around, maybe a few each day, because that can also kind of make things more organized, and then we're not losing time looking for stuff. If you are settling into a dorm room and you don't really have an organizational system, you might pick up some bins or filing things to help you with that. And then one of the biggest time savers is not trying to multitask. So people think that multitasking, we get more done, but we're actually less productive because we're shifting so much that we're not really getting any one thing done. So to do one thing at a time, we become more productive and therefore save time. So this slide is all about getting organized, and it's a really good thing to be thinking about at the start of the semester. So if you've already started the semester, you might have syllabi from every class. So a great exercise to do before work starts to pile up is to gather all of those syllabi together and have some kind of master calendar with everything due. And then already from the get-go, we're starting to see, oh, we have this 1 week where 2 really big things are due from 2 different classes. So I'm starting to anticipate what the semester is going to look like, and I'm less likely to be caught off guard that something is due. So if we have that one monthly calendar, whether it's virtual, a planner, an app, something like that, we also then want to have like a weekly and daily kind of list as well. And some organizational tools have all of those in one. A weekly planner, would be a little more specific with more, maybe more task-oriented goals, like which things are going to study, things like that. And then a daily to-do list, ideally we're putting that in SMART goal format of the things we're going to do just that day. It would be probably best to just focus on 1 to 3 priorities for the day. If there's smaller things, maybe we have more, but I think just having 3 things that we solidly want to finish and getting them done can feel really, really good. And then might actually motivate us to keep going and do more. Whereas if we put 15 things on the to-do list and only get to 3, we're going to feel kind of like we failed that day and less motivated the next one. And I'm a huge advocate of setting reminders and alarms. There are things that like I would never remember if I didn't have an alarm going off. So make use of that. If you have old alarms or reminders that you're ignoring and are just kind of cluttering your phone, try to delete those and restart for the semester. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about attention and focus. So attention and concentration, we use them kind of interchangeably sometimes, but they are different things. So attention is the process where we're controlling our awareness of what's going on, attending to something, versus concentration is the ability to keep refocusing on a particular stimulus or message. So we're kind of coming back again and again to that same thing. If we have not attended to something, we're not going to be able to remember it. Actually, recalling it doesn't mean anything because we never encoded it in our memory. So a classic example of this is if we're introducing ourselves to someone, we make it really nervous about saying our name, then we don't listen to what someone else said was their name. And then we might say like, oh, I don't remember what they said, but it's because we never actually attended to it. It's not that we can't retrieve it, it's that we never encoded it in our memory. Some things to start asking yourself is, where am I most distracted? When am I most distracted? Whether it's time of day or level of anxiety, things like that. And then who is most likely to distract me? And then starting to think about what can I do to address these challenges, rather than just seeing yourself as someone who gets distracted. Like, see if you can try to change the circumstances surrounding how you work in order to prevent this from happening. This is another self exercise you can do where you think about the top 3 places you study, and then you evaluate each one based on, it could be these factors or other ones. I spend a lot of time on my phone. Is that true for these locations? I begin studying right away. The setting, like the lighting, the temperature, is that satisfactory? And it might be that the most common places you work are not necessarily the most optimal or effective. So if you prefer to study in your bed because it's really cozy and comfortable and you don't have to go anywhere, that's great. But if you realize you're tempted to watch TV or fall asleep, or you're just not in work mode, then you might need to accept that one's just not working for you. So it's good to take stock of your study habits and see which ones work best. This is a note on, pandemic specific, the idea that we might be working or taking class or studying at home for often. Even if you are in a dorm this semester, we might be taking some virtual classes. So one thing that can really help is really getting a good desk setup. I think we are deep into the pandemic and there's still some people that are, working from, a space that really isn't a desk or a chair that's really not comfortable, or not really having all of their work stuff right there like they would if they were at school. So really trying to create an environment that maybe, if we think back to pre-pandemic, what did that look like? What did I have in front of me? And also using the same organizational tools too. I think a lot of people I've worked with, realized that when they shifted and came home, they didn't keep up the same habits that were working, even though they could easily be done at home too. Obviously, there's some special concerns with working or studying at home in terms of being with other people, there being noise or distractions. So trying to really have what you need, like headphones or white noise to help cancel out that sound. Definitely trying to pick a space other than your bed or where you do fun stuff to do your work. So we're in a different mindset. And then also if we do work in our bed, it makes it really hard to fall asleep because we would associate our bed with working. Having an arc to our day is a new concept that's coming out in the pandemic, which is if we are at home, doing or studying or classes online, it can be really disorienting that we don't really have a commute or a time we're going outside and then coming back home. So one way to create this is to maybe go outside for a short walk in the morning before class, and then also in the evening after class, to just kind of signal to the brain that we're starting and stopping the day. Breaks it up a little bit more. When we are structuring our environment, we want to think about external distractions and internal distractions. So external distractions, in order to do that, we might try to have everything we need right there. So we're not tempted to go pick up other stuff from other parts of our apartment or our dorm room, and then we get distracted by something. Having everything ready to go when you sit down. As I mentioned before, some technology can help with this. If we're in a lecture hall, moving to the front of the room can be really helpful if you get easily distracted. If we're in the way back of the lecture hall, we're going to see everyone's movement and fidgeting, what they're doing on their laptop, which can be super distracting. So trying to come in the front where you can just see the professor. And then, of course, there's ways we can change our settings on our phone or laptop in order to reduce interruptions for really trying to get down to work. And then perhaps harder to deal with is what we call internal distractions. Those would be thoughts, emotions, obsessions, worries. So one of the best ways to kind of deal with these is if we start getting really anxious or worried about the test coming up, is to take a step away just for a brief moment, take some breaths, and then do something to try to calm yourself down before you come back to the issue. I think a lot of times when we're worried, we're like, I can't take a break, I can't stop, I need to study. But really, if we're studying with this kind of high distress, it's not going to be really effective. So it's definitely worth it to take some time away. And at the bottom here are just some common unhelpful thinking patterns. Seeing if you can identify yourself in any of these, like the worrier or the critic who judges or evaluates yourself, the victim who feels kind of helpless, never going to be good enough, no matter how hard I try, and then the perfectionist, efforts aren't good enough, I have to be perfect, I have to get an A, otherwise I'm failing. And these are patterns I'm thinking that affect all of our aspects of our life, but in particular academics as well. So starting to get to know yourself and what are some of those unhelpful thinking traps you fall into. Some tips for if the internal distraction is worrying. So one thing we can do is to shift the focus to what can I do to prevent my worries from coming true. So if I'm worried about failing my test because I just started studying the night before and there's so much material, I might get caught up in that, but instead focusing on what can I do right now? I have probably 3 hours before I go to bed. What can I do about it now? Knowing that this is the time I have, doing the best I can to try to prevent it by reviewing the material. Using relaxation techniques. I'm not going to go into specifics here, but there are a lot out there, a lot of free resources too for relaxation, audio recordings and things like that. You could also use mindfulness techniques. You could try out the app Headspace, which helps us with mindfulness. And then if you find these, initial tips aren't really enough, you might actually consider joining cognitive behavioral therapy, getting some additional support on managing the worry or depression or ADHD that might be interfering with your productivity. So those are all patterns that we might be experiencing that might make it really hard to focus. Like even if we are good at studying or know what's going on, those things can kind of just create a layer that makes it hard to pay attention. And at our practice, we offer cognitive behavioral therapy for all ages if you're interested. This is a list of thoughts that drive procrastination. So the idea of like putting off what we are trying to get done. And we would consider these basically myths about our work that we might be buying into that make us wait to do something, but in reality, they're not so helpful to believe. So sometimes we have unrealistic ideas like I should wait until I want to start, like, or if I feel motivated. Unfortunately, for some things, we'll never feel motivated to do them. So waiting for that could be a very long time. And we can actually do a lot, even if we don't feel motivated. Think about all the things you did, even maybe this morning, that you didn't feel motivated to do, like getting out of bed or taking out the trash. You maybe didn't want to, but you did them. So to try to kind of challenge that idea that I have to want to do it in order to start it. And then you'll see just like a number of other ones. And these are all kind of myths that might be tripping us up. TikTok, not to be confused with the app TikTok, is a long-time CBT technique, which is meant to help with some of these problematic thoughts that lead to procrastination. So the TIC stands for task interfering cognition or thought, and then TOC stands for task orienting cognition or TOC. So if we figure out what is that common belief that I tell myself that makes me procrastinate, and then in turn, what am I going to say in response to myself to make me approach the task? So if I know a classic one for me is I'll do it later. It's fine. I have time. An example of TOC might be, realistically, I rarely do it later. When I say, well, it will feel good to get some of it started now. So that is just kind of what we're rehearsing the response to that common procrastination thought. This is just a slide to illustrate sometimes what procrastination cycles look like. We often start off super motivated, it's gonna be different this time, then we start to get anxious. And then, when we haven't started it a few days before, we feel really hopeless, and then kind of vow to never do it again, and then finally take action the night before. So some additional strategies for reducing procrastination. When you want to avoid, approach it. It's easier said than done, but that's basically the idea, is like approaching what we want to avoid, even in small ways. So if I'm terrified to start writing this paper, maybe I just open up the assignment, I get the book out that I need to read for it. I have stuff ready to go. That's still an approaching, even if I'm not starting it yet. So maybe small ways to approach can ease us in. Not waiting until you feel like it is what I mentioned before, and trying to make approaching the task easy. So there's something called the 5-minute plan, which is I'll do it for just 5 minutes. So thinking about it, like even the most subversive task, if we say I'll just do it for 5 minutes, doesn't sound so bad. So that can be a way to get us started. And then after that, you can decide to stop if you said 5 minutes, or you can decide, can I do another 5 minutes? Let me see. And usually once we're in it, we're able to keep going. It's kind of like if we said, I'm going to run on the treadmill for 5 minutes. It feels pretty easy. If we finish that, we're already on the treadmill, we're already running, and we ask ourselves, can I do another 5? The answer will likely be yes. And even if it's not, at least we've done the 5 minutes. Chunking really large projects into smaller tasks can be really helpful. So if you have like a 15-page paper, to break down all the steps that are going to lead up to that final paper, and then taking just that one task as your SMART goal for the day. Having an attitude of starting it rather than finishing it, just working on things a little bit at a time. Being accountable, we mentioned before, and then trying to anticipate frustration with certain tasks and come up with like a cope ahead plan for what will I do when I start to get frustrated or feel like this is too hard. Who can I call? What timeout can I take? What can I do to kind of bring myself back down? Additional ideas for reducing procrastination. Some people prefer to start with what they don't like to get out of the way. And then for others, they like to start with what feels easiest just to get them moving. So kind of two contradictory strategies, but in different scenarios can work depending on how you're feeling. Definitely trying to use those things to reduce temptation to procrastinate, like turning internet off on your computer if you don't need it for the assignment, or even using some of those services that can help you block certain websites for periods of time. And while all of them can be undone, if we have to take that extra step to unblock it, it might just make us think a little bit longer before we do that. The app Pomodoro is really helpful for chunking our time. What it does is you have short stretches of work and short breaks, and then we keep repeating that. And then if we do that for long enough, we earn a longer break. So knowing we have a break coming up can sometimes help us stick with the task we're doing. And then being able to really enjoy those breaks, because they're not procrastination breaks, they're built-in breaks that we've given ourselves. So if we're sitting for a final and we have lunch with a friend as a break, but we're thinking about the final and talking about it the whole time, it's not really a break. And then also trying to find encouraging quotes, songs, phrases, play that song or have that sitting on your computer, just as ways to keep you motivated. And then definitely make use of rewards. So if you've been wanting to avoid something for a really long time, so think about, once I get it done, how can I reward myself? Maybe it's getting your favorite coffee treat on campus, or some time with friends, or watching the movie you've been wanting to see for a while. But knowing we have that light at the end of the tunnel sometimes helps us get something off the list. Okay, so I'm just going to touch briefly on memory, and that'll bring us into study strategies that are more or less helpful. So if we look at this list, I want you to just look for a moment and try to memorize as much as you can. So now you think, okay, what can I remember? It might be kind of tricky. At least for me, it would be. However, if we look back at these letters, it's actually some pretty recognizable patterns here. If you have FBI, MTD, USA. So this is to show you that if you just looked at this list and then had to say the letters back, it would be so much easier. So when we manipulate material and organize it in a certain way that means something to us, it's easier to recall it. So this is like a simple way of showing that, and we'll talk about more complex ways we can do that. So a lot of people try to study by just rehearsing things. They keep repeating things or reading things over and over, like the textbook or your notes. But that is a very passive way of studying. And we can do that without a lot of thought. And sometimes we're not even really memorizing it at all. The much more effective strategy would be to try to manipulate the information in some way, put it into categories, relate it to other things, making some kind of meaning out of it, like the way we grouped the letters into meaningful ways to remember them. That's what's going to make the information last longer. So some more on this. So rote learning is that kind of like passive, just rehearsing it over and over. A really common thing that students do is just copying over their notes. For most people, it's incredibly ineffective and is just wasting a lot of time. And then also taking verbatim notes as your professor speaks tends to be pretty unhelpful. It would be actually a lot more effective if you listen and then take into mind what's the main point here, or paraphrase it or summarize it in a way that makes sense to you, and write that down in your notebook. Other common strategies that are proven to be less effective are underlining, highlighting. Again, they're passive, and most of us end up highlighting half of the book. And then what do we even really do with that? We end up going back to the textbook and just like reading it again. Much better to kind of pull, what are the takeaways, organize them in a new way, and put it in some kind of outline about what you read. cramming as a concept is generally to be avoided. You know, when we try to mass all of our studying in at one time, we're just much less likely to do well on the exam because we haven't really learned it. If we distribute the practice over time, we give a chance for what we're learning to consolidate and to retain it for the exam. Attention improves with intention. This is just the idea of when we ask ourselves, what are we trying to learn? The more likely we are to engage with the material in a more active way. So sometimes we just read something without really thinking about like, what am I trying to learn? But instead, if we, look at the chapter, look at the title, look at the headings, and try to think, what am I likely supposed to learn from this? And then answering that question as we read can be a much more effective way to read something. Another great strategy is to write your own test questions. That's probably the best way to prepare for an exam. It's just, if you were the teacher, what would you ask? And then answering those. Because then you're forcing yourself to, again, manipulate the information and think about what's most important. You could even write questions, and maybe a friend writes questions, and then you exchange them and have to answer one another's. With math or science, where we're doing like problem type work, the best thing to do is keep doing problems. Again, more active. If we just review the problems I've already done, that's a more passive, ineffective strategy. And same thing here, create your own problems. Create your own math problems or science problems and answer them. That would be really a good strategy. And then occasionally checking in on, did I understand what I just read? How focused am I right now? That can help us prevent, wasting hours kind of doing ineffective or not attentive kind of studying. And then this is just a little more on how do we kind of organize information to make it more meaningful to us. So things like hierarchies or outlines or matrices can give us like a more nuanced understanding of something rather than just like the order in which the professor described it in the lecture or the order in which it was presented in the textbook. Okay, so this is mostly a summary of what I've just talked about, but just to point out a couple other passive strategies would be taping lectures and re-listening to them. It's the same thing as just like writing down word for word what the professor's saying. Flashcards can, if done in a certain way, can be a little too passive. We're just rehearsing it rather than manipulating the information. Some things that we might want to do is, if a professor talks really quickly, don't try to take verbatim notes. Just like leave gaps if you miss something and just pick up where you left off. And maybe if you have a friend in the class, you can try to fill in the blanks. A lot of professors will give cues that we might miss about what's really important. If they say like, you'll need to know this for the test, or they repeat something a whole bunch, or they write it on a whiteboard or put it in a slide, take note as to help you decide what's going to be the most important information to study. Another tip is to use textbooks more as a reference rather than a novel. At most college level classes, it's almost impossible to read like a book, all of the reading for all of your classes, especially certain kinds of classes that are reading heavy. So to think about it as like a reference that you can look up certain things, get the gist of certain things, rather than having to read it start to finish. And if we have a really long stretch of time, like I'm studying all day Saturday, trying to alternate the subjects rather than like for 5 hours I'm doing math and then 5 hours I'm doing my English class, maybe alternating hour by hour to kind of keep us fresh and more focused. Okay, so obviously I just threw a whole bunch of tips at you. And in the spirit of sparkles, I would suggest picking maybe 2, maybe 3 of the most helpful tips and try to turn it into a sparkle for yourself. I want you to also recognize that change takes time. So if a lot of this is really tough for you, it's not going to change overnight, but it's great that you showed up and, are wanting to learn these things. And even small changes can make a big difference sometimes. So even the smallest of successes, trying to acknowledge and reward those for yourself. And hopefully that helps us make bigger and bigger changes. And then one of the most helpful things in my mind is aiming for progress rather than perfection. When I tell myself it has to be perfect, I get, much more overwhelmed, and I'm like, I'm just looking for progress, improvement. Here's my contact information if you have any questions after this presentation, if you're interested in hearing more about CBT. And in general, here's our contact information. If you want to sign up for CBT, you could also just directly call our intake coordinator, Kayla, and here's her contact information. And then our website has a whole lot of information on CBT and other kind of resources. I just want to shout out to a former supervisor of mine, Nicole Green, who's at UCLA, who created a lot of the material that this was adapted from. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Feel free to stay after if you guys have any questions. Otherwise, hope everyone has a wonderful day, and thanks for coming. Oh,
hi, I have a question.
Hi. Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed that. I felt like I really could relate to a lot of it, considering
Great.
a lot of the things that you mentioned, and I really loved, especially because I struggle with procrastination. I struggle with starting with something and getting it done. Example, like I'm moving to the city and I have all these boxes downstairs that I need to do. And in the past 3 days, I probably have 15 boxes and I've done like 3. And I go downstairs and I just sit there and I stare. I just stare for about like 2 hours. And then I'm like, I'll do it later. It's the starting for it's like, okay, I'll write the list and then I won't, and then I'll stop there. Like, how do you get over like that first hump?
Yeah, I mean, it can be really tricky, and there's probably lots of variables and lots of things we could try to initiate. One thing that maybe the sentiment came across from the material, but one thing that helps me is like, if I'm avoiding something, the goal is too big, the step is too large, so maybe the step is just like, I don't even know if you've like formed the boxes yet, put them together. Maybe that's step 1.
Right.
Or labeling the boxes, and then you're done. That's it. Or the goal is put 2 items into my 2 books into my book moving box, and that sounds so silly. It sounds so small, but maybe we do that. And if we did that like every few hours, then we're getting somewhere. And sometimes that leads to doing more. And then the other thing I would say is like trying to just check in when you feel frozen. What's going on internally? What am I feeling? Any emotions? Am I having any thoughts? I'm having any of those thoughts like this will be too hard, or I can't do this, or anything at all that's blocking you. And then seeing, can I try to change that language a bit? Like if I'm telling myself it's too hard, it's like, I can do this. I've moved before. I got this. It's stressful, but I got it.
I do like self-sabotage almost.
Right. So it might even be some of those thoughts coming in of like, of course, you're not going to get this done. What's wrong with you? You always do this. So maybe shifting to a more like non-judgmental of like, this is hard for me. I know that, and that's okay. All I can do is at one step at a time, and then I'll get there.
Yeah.
So that internal monologue can play a big role as well. And if you're anxious, if it's something like that, maybe even just putting on some lighter music or one of your favorite shows, just to kind of like soften the tone a little bit. Like if we're so nervous about approaching something, like keep it a little lighter. It's like we're just packing boxes while listening to music.
Yeah, why do I think it's like the biggest task in the world?
Yeah,
Really?
right. And sometimes we're thinking that without realizing like what's going through our mind, and it's really impacting us.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for coming.
Of course, I enjoyed it.
All right, bye.
Bye.